Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone who's visiting today. So in talking streamlining data migration into Salesforce, the success that I've had with Snowflake and Datameer really does originate back to my role, as was mentioned, running a data and analytics team. And so what's happened over time through that success and through successful rollout of this modern data platform, really I was able to translate that to a very common data challenge, which is data migration. And so what we're going to do today is spend some time together to talk through that journey and share some of the best practices and tips and things that I've learned along the way, which has ultimately led me down the path to create Data Tools Pro, which you'll also get a sneak peek of as I demonstrate Datameer and Data Tools Pro together. So when we talk about data migrations, or in this case, data migrations into Salesforce, for those of you who may have gone through that experience, and I'll try not to use air quotes, but I might get some on video, that experience, for me, being on the other end of one of these data migrations, I've only felt that feeling doing one other thing. And that was the time I decided to install my own hardwood floors. So watching a video, buying some tools, and just jumping into it. I remember being on the other end of my, do-it-yourself project and thinking to myself, wow, what a gratifying feeling to have finished the project, but I never ever want to do that again. And that's kind of how I felt about data migrations. I was kind of pulled into one of these, projects, having to consolidate multiple Salesforce instances. We brought in some ETL technology and some consultants, and certainly we got through it, but it was very painful. And so what we're going to talk about today is how the transition for me, right, having implanted Snowflake and Datameer, really gave pause where I could take a step back and rethink, all right, if I have a modern data stack at my disposal, how much less painful could data migration be? And that's really what we're going to look at. So before we jump into the technology, let's talk a little bit about the challenges and why these migrations could be painful. The first thing that you run into when doing a migration is typically, like any data and technology project, right? You're working with a cross-functional team. You're going to have either entire teams or individuals from data, your Salesforce admins, potentially the existing application you're migrating from, whether it's another Salesforce instance or, in my case, a legacy application, and then the business stakeholders who ultimately you need to help you sanity check and validate and sign off that the information is looks right and is complete. So typically what I've done with data migrations is like anything, you have to have a concise plan. And what I do and what I've built is a blueprint and a 45-day plan working backwards from go live or cutover, 40 days backwards. So you have very clear milestones that you have to hit going into your data migration, so that are you on schedule? Are you on task? Or are you going to be scrambling at the last minute, which is never good. Moving from the team to the data, in the history of data migrations, you're never going to have perfect or pristine data. You're always going to be moving some dirty data over from your existing process. And depending how far back in time you go, you may be finding yourself stumbling over multiple regimes of process and dirty data. And ultimately, what you have to come to grips with, one, is that you're going to be moving some dirty data, but two, is that the data migration project itself is not the time to kick off a data quality initiative. Because if you do, I can promise you, you're never going to meet your deadline and your scope is going to explode. And so what you have to get everyone to buy into is that post-migration, by all means, you can kick off a data quality initiative or master data initiative with Salesforce, or you need to plan and just pad your project to deal with the data quality issues. And for me, I always say that you should fix data quality only to the point where it would impact or impede on your new Salesforce application from running, meaning that if your data is poor and it's going to break automation or it's going to invalidate the migration itself, by all means, you have to fix that. But you shouldn't go crazy trying to fix potentially years worth of bad data. And then the final one, at least for this webinar, has to do with the data mapping, preparation, and sign-off. That's arguably where a bulk share of your workload occurs during a migration project. And so it goes without saying, we're here to talk about today that having the right tools for the job, or rethinking what tools you're using for migration could certainly make a big difference. And that's obviously what we're here to showcase. So as I mentioned, my day-to-day for the last few years has been running a data and analytics team. And so my focus is really transitioning from this world that's really the world I've been living in for the last 15 years, 20 years, is a traditional ETL enterprise data warehouse data infrastructure. And so you have your business apps, you do your extract, transform, and load in your data warehouse, and now you've got data that's business friendly, ready for reporting and analytics. And that's a model that's certainly served really every company is, for the last 30 years. And so we've seen an incredible shift with modern cloud data warehouses and data lake platforms like Snowflake. And so this is the transition that I moved the organization through, where we were from our business apps, Salesforce, and a SQL-based application. We were extracting our transactional data into our Snowflake data lake, and then we ultimately chose Datameer as the platform to do all of our data preparation, all of our business transformations, so that we could ultimately serve it up for analytics use cases, reporting and analytics, and data science. And so maybe 6 months ago, I had actually done a webinar with the folks here at Datameer to showcase that transformation and how incredible it was. Now, beyond that, we actually took that same data warehouse that we built, and we had constructed some reverse ETL data pipelines back into our business application. So the specific use case is that we were taking metrics related to sales capacity and utilization, and we were actually moving that data back into Salesforce.com. And ultimately, Datameer was the data preparation layer for us to have that data ready to shift back into Salesforce. Now, back to data migration. I didn't have this ETL or ELT and reverse ETL technology stack at my disposal when I was running my data migrations. And so I kept thinking to myself, man, how much easier, better could my life have been if I had this platform at my disposal? And it was always kind of in the back of my mind, but I never got to put it into practice until recently. And it kind of, this whole Data Tools Pro and data migration kit came from a friend approaching me last year who was tasked with a pretty large data migration project. And we had been talking about the pain I experienced with my migration, and he asked for some tips. And so I actually took some time and put out this 20-point checklist for him to go back and plan his data migration. And that was really kind of the birth or the spark behind some of the work that I've done with my migration blueprint. And so that spark turned into something a little bit more last year after we had successfully built this reverse ETL functionality. And I thought to myself, how much time could I save, right? If I was to go off and do another one of these migrations, maybe I'm a crazy person, but how much time literally could I save if I took this technology with the blueprint that I created? And so what did I do? I went out and found a customer, and I embarked on nights and weekends, kind of moonlighting, kicking off and implementing a data migration project. And ultimately, what I went from was this traditional ETL stack that I had used previously, and it worked well and it was successful. And then I moved to this cloud ELT, reverse ETL stack. And so I used this specific approach that we're going to dig a little bit deeper into with Datameer. I worked with a customer that I'll show in a little bit, and we were able to get substantial time savings. I mean, roughly cut the data preparation and validation and mapping exercise into half of the time that it took with the previous data migration. Specifically, we worked with a nonprofit, Hager Sisters, and they were fantastic and flexible. But ultimately, we were able to take 20 tables out of their existing platform, and we were able to transform and migrate all 20 objects into their brand new Salesforce instance. And we were able to do that in 6 weeks. And they had an 8-week launch window. We were able to meet the launch window. And it was a smashing success for everyone involved. And I think more importantly for me, back to that original graphic of the pain of laying my hardwood floors, rather than, don't mind, I think I still had a little bit of that feeling like, wow, that was still a grind, right, with the tight deadlines. But more importantly, I felt more excited around, okay, how do I take this and iterate on it? How do I refine this even more? Because I felt that I had the right technology to execute, but I wanted to reformulate and figure out ways to save time on the front end when it came to data mapping and working with the business stakeholders and organizing the project. Like that part of the migration project was the pain, rather than the mechanics of working with and preparing and moving the data. And that really was kind of the birth of Data Tools Pro. So to get very specific on the time savings before we jump into the tech, these are the areas where I saw the largest gains, right? So we talk about setup and config. When you're working with cloud, setup and config is a handful of clicks to stand up your Snowflake instance. Datameer is go to a web form, fill it out, and a few minutes of configuration to Snowflake and you're off. There's some security and role management and things like that, and that's really where the time utilization comes into play. But it was super fast to get everything up and running. And then I'm going to jump ahead. I'm not going to go line by line for time's sake, but really where I saw the biggest gain had to do with the transformation of data, the validation and sign off, the fact that I was able to get the stakeholder on the phone in a web share inside of Datameer, and we were slicing and dicing and validating and walking through the data together, as opposed to that back and forth over the fence. So this collaborative way of working and the speed that we can go through with Datameer is really where I saw this incredible time savings. So with that, as I mentioned before we jump into the demo, there's two areas that I had worked through this data migration. The first part that I'll showcase in a minute had to do with how do we report progress? How do we organize ourselves? How do we manage the data migration project? And that's really where I'm now putting in time with some longtime collaborators on building this Data Tools Pro app. And the intent for me is to build this Data Tool Pros app as a free application, because what I found myself doing was jumping between Google Sheets and DevTools and Workbench. So for our Salesforce guys on the phone, everyone knows about Workbench and DevTools and these free utilities that save a ton of time. But what I found myself doing was jumping between 5 or 6 tools just to manage the nuts and bolts. And so I've worked with a team to build this free Data Tools app that we're putting out to help hopefully facilitate the random nuts and bolts of doing the data migration. And then when it comes to Datameer, in doing the heavy lift, this is where 80% of the work happens. When it comes to data profiling and collaborating with data and preparing data, and then after you move the data, you're having to do a ton of post-migration analysis and profiling, and then retaining that knowledge. this is where we've gotten the massive gains and time savings by having all of this data sense making and data wrangling all in one place. And then to be able to get the data engineers, analysts, and your kind of business stakeholders or business, more tech savvy business stakeholders in one place, that's where I'm seeing the biggest benefit here. So with that, what I want to do is actually jump in to a quick demonstration here where we can actually see what this looks like in real time. So I'm actually going to bring my screen over here. And so hopefully we can see my screen. So this is the Data Tools app. And ultimately what this does is it connects directly into your Salesforce instance, and it only connects to metadata, so the objects and fields. So the idea is that you can click and select only the objects that you're migrating into, and it will then automatically populate a scorecard so that you can keep track of where you're at in the data migration process. Now, I can go one level deeper into the individual objects, and at my disposal, I have a dictionary of all of the fields in the object. And then I can go to migration. And now migration is typically where you're doing this data mapping exercise. And historically, I've been stuck in Google Sheets or Excel, and I end up passing around this Excel sheet to different stakeholders or folks on the team that have expertise around the system to try to figure out how to do my data mapping before I then hand it off to my ETL or data team. And so what I've tried or attempted to do with Data Tools Pro is simulate and recreate some of that work that has historically had to happen in Excel, yet make it a little bit easier to navigate your way around the data. So field by field, you can dictate and define what you're doing with the data. Either you're going to ignore it, you're not going to migrate it, you're going to define some business semantics or logic, you're going to do things like pick list mapping. So if I want to roll through and focus specifically on pick lists and do all of my data mapping there, I have everything that I need at my disposal to walk through that process. Now, additionally, what we've been looking to do and what we've been working on when it comes to this data mapping exercise is also taking a look at things like logic and formulas, and how do we use technology like ChatGPT, or not ChatGPT, but GPT-4 to help us automate some of that process. So we built functionality around pick list mapping and also around explanation of fields, where it will basically reverse engineer formulas and explain what's inside of a formula field, for example. And in fact, let me go back. I think it's on, I was clicking around. This is the joy of a live demo. I think I was looking at the account. Let me dive into opportunity real quick. I think that's where I had my, there we go. So anything that is a formula field gets basically flagged as a, and so ultimately in this case, I've got a 2-digit NIX code. And so what it will do is we'll bump up the 2-digit NIX code against GPT. It will run a quick analysis and it will spit out a plain English explanation of your formula, hopefully. And ultimately, yeah, there you go. So it's using the name of the field if you had a description in Salesforce and the formula, and it's trying to compare all three of those things to help you explain what it is. This is a very simple example, but if you've ever had to roll through a massive long nested if or case statement, this is the kind of things that you get buried where we're trying to save time. So similarly, we're doing the same thing with pick lists, where if you're trying to map states and countries and those kind of things, we're trying to streamline or get rid of the manual work associated with that. So the other part of the scorecard and where we saved a lot of time is that when you're migrating 20 objects, trying to keep track of data mapping and the ETL logic and business logic is somewhat daunting, right? And you're having to keep documentation and you're having to report progress. So what I found with this tool is I can go from the scorecard directly into Datameer. And so I can go, if I want to go in and drill from my account or opportunity work that I'm doing, this jumped me right into the Datameer project to the specific node in my flow where we're writing, in this case, SQL to help do the transformation to prepare it to migrate into Salesforce. So what we're looking at now is Datameer. And as I mentioned, there's a ton of time savings that we get in leveraging Datameer. One is that you have a nice visual representation, especially when you're having to merge and join multiple objects together. So one of the very first things that you end up doing is profiling and analyzing your data when you're doing migration. So I can come in, I can go to the profile tab. I mean, one, I can look at my data, and mind you, this is not real data, so we don't have to worry about customer names or anything. But if I go into profile, I can look at state, for example. I click a button, and it will give me a quick profile of that specific field. I know if I'm missing data. So in this case, I've got one missing record. I know if I've got some white space. I know how many unique records I have. And in this particular case, it looks like I'm missing a state. So as I mentioned, as I led, right, you don't want to get buried in every data quality issue along the path of data migration. But if I did need to figure out, okay, I want to raise this back to the business or the business owner, I can go up to exploration, I click a button, it gives me this really simple, intuitive ad hoc analysis or exploration dropdown. I go to state, I say, okay, show me just the missing records. I hit create. It'll pop out one of these exploration tabs. And now I can go ahead and send this off to my business stakeholder and say, hey, just FYI, I'm profiling the data. We're missing a state here. Maybe you want to correct this. And then I can just keep going about my day. If I really wanted to, I can go into my detail. I can add a comment that says, hey, I found a missing state. I've noted it to myself, and I can just keep going. Where historically, I may have had to jump through 3 different tools and email, and I've just lost 10 minutes of my day just because we're missing one state. So from a data exploration standpoint and a data profiling standpoint, Datameer does a really good job of just getting me to a point where I have my bearings. Now, the other area that's saved me a ton of time has to do with joining data sets together. If I click on this join node and I go and I edit my join, in this case, I'm just joining an opportunity with an account out of Salesforce, very basic, very basic function here. And so what Datameer will do is it will automatically compare both sides of the join, and it will show me what falls out of my join. And in this case, we can see on the account side, right, I don't have any orphaned accounts. And on my opportunities, I have 4 opportunities, other way around, sorry. I don't have any orphaned opportunities from an account because it's a required field. But on the other side, I have 4 accounts that do not have an opportunity. Similarly, if I go to join keys, what it will show me is if I had any Cartesian product or any issues with cardinality, this screen would actually highlight those potential issues, right? Where I have many-to-many records, this would highlight that. But in this case, what this is telling me is I have 10 opportunities mapped to 1 account. And in every case, I don't have any potential many-to-many joined issues. So those kind of things, when you're not familiar with the data, to not have to create those things certainly saves me quite a bit of time. So that kind of covers us on profiling. When it comes to collaboration, I think I've already demonstrated the two ways that Datameer saved us a lot of time around collaboration. One was just being able to simply export data very quickly, and being able to do in line with my data validation and profiling process. When it comes to data preparation, when we're doing data migration, typically, and the no-code abilities of Datameer definitely makes things really nice. But at the end of the day, when it comes to data migration, I have a very rigid, very specific data format, data type, and data naming convention that I need to adhere to. Because the idea when I'm building data migration flows through Datameer and through the data migration, ultimately the data out of Datameer into a Snowflake view needs to be formatted exactly as the way it will exist when it goes into Salesforce.com. So you can see that I have the Salesforce field names pre-populated, and then ultimately we're doing mapping and we're performing certain conversions or concatenations or mapping directly in SQL. So at the end of the day, I benefit in both ways, right? I have a quick way to use this low no-code wizard to build and construct and understand my data. But then at the end of the day, whether I have my data engineer or my ETL developer, I can have them in writing SQL in a way that they're comfortable with, while still giving my data analysts and potential power users on the business side constant visibility into what's being created. So when we're ready to deploy this and move this into the queue for data migration, out of the SQL, I'm actually just generating a Snowflake view. And another very important aspect of data migration has to deal with version control, right? Because if you're moving fast and you need to move fast, and you're wanting to keep track of what is changing over time, Datameer provides that out of the box. So when I deploy and ready to migration, it actually keeps track of every deployment that I make, so that ultimately if something breaks and you inevitably ask yourself, hey, what changed? I have full access to the SQL code and I can go backwards, along with having just some basic notes at the point of deployment of what we're pushing out. And so finally, the last item when it comes to data migration that's so important is knowledge retention. And so the deployment history itself is extremely important for knowledge retention, but also when we build these data migrations, post-data migration, so after you move the data, there's this post-migration validation exercise that you go through. And obviously you want to make sure that if you migrate 1,000 rows, that 1,000 rows show up inside of Salesforce. That's like a no-brainer. But more importantly, for a successful data migration, you have to work with the business stakeholders, business owners, to understand in Salesforce.com, when you move, Salesforce is going to be the source of truth for some number of metrics. If it's a CRM, certainly all of your sales metrics. So what I found historically was that I was having to build Excel, or using my BI tools, or using Salesforce itself. I would have to construct a whole bunch of reports to perform data validation, and it was so painfully manual. With this workflow, ultimately the migration to Salesforce.com, my data pipelines are set up so that the minute I put the data in Salesforce, I then immediately pull it out to make it available in Snowflake and in turn Datameer. So what I end up doing is loading my sandbox or production Salesforce data, and then I can build the same reports that I used to have to build in Excel or in Salesforce. I can build them in Datameer. And so what you end up in post-migration is 5 or 6 or even 10 of these validation nodes. And these validation nodes let me run through one by one. And if I want to automate them, I can. But ultimately, I can go one by one and review the data as wearing the business stakeholder hat. And I can go and I can match this up against existing legacy reports, because what Datameer allows you to do is to take reports maybe out of my legacy system, and I can actually upload the data from those reports right from within Datameer. So now I can compare my old report against the brand new data, brand new migrated data immediately after I push the button to move it. So once again, this concept of having the entire data lifecycle exist in one place and then bringing it back to where we started, to then be able to roll that up into one tool where I can quickly get in and out and roll through this process and iterate many, many times, is where I got that significant time savings. So with that, we'll bring it back. And I'm gonna fast forward through some slides. So kind of as we wrap up, and as you look at the Datameer demo, right, all of that Datameer work that I was just showing you sits directly on top of Snowflake. So there's no data being moved or shuttled around at any point. And so ultimately the byproduct, when we did the data migration, even for Hager Sisters, was a ready-made data lake and data warehouse for Salesforce.com. So we were using a data platform really designed originally for data and analytics and data warehouses as a data migration toolkit. But the output was a fully functioning, essentially a data lake. But through the post-migration validation, we essentially had to build the reporting capabilities. And so on day one, we literally had a functioning data warehouse to some extent. And so that's a very important piece, because at the end of the day, the last thing you want to do is get through data migration and then figure out, okay, how is my team going to report on this? And so, the other takeaway, hopefully, is having gone through, many data migrations and having starting to iterate as Data Tools Pro. Obviously, we're here to provide tools and guidance and free knowledge, right? As we continue forward. And so at any point, if you do want help or you want some guidance, we're here to help. That's what we're here for. So whether you want to learn a little bit more about Datameer and how we're using Datameer for data migrations or for analytics, by all means, we can schedule a session and jump in the way that we did on the webinar. Certainly, you can go yourself to datameer.com, sign up for a trial, connect it to your Snowflake instance, and go the same way I was showing you today. And then you can also come back to Data Tools Pro, where we have a list of free tutorials that walk you through how to use some of the features and functionality that I showed you today. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap it up, and we can open it up for Q&A. And thank you all for joining today. Really appreciate the time, and look forward to hearing about your data migration adventures.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. It looks like we've got a few Q&As here, so we'll go ahead and go through that. And then for everybody still here, if you have any questions, please just pop those in the Q&A chat below. Okay, so first one is, does Datameer require Snowflake?
Yes, so Datameer does require Snowflake, but the beauty of Datameer in itself is how tight it is integrated with Snowflake. The benefit of Snowflake and Datameer is that none of the data leaves Snowflake. So all of those operations, all the profiling and analysis and slicing and dicing is literally using the Snowflake engine to do all of that lifting and processing. And what Datameer is doing is it's making it super easy to consume and to create. So yes, they are as tightly joined and coupled together, and that's to your benefit.
Thank you. Okay, so next one is, how do you get the data in and out of Salesforce?
That's a great question. I did not go into that in great detail. So for getting data out in and out of Snowflake or out of Salesforce, technically you can really use any data pipeline technology. There's a ton of them in the marketplace. In the case of Hager Sisters, in the case of Hager Sisters, we were using Azure Data Factory. So our Snowflake instance was stood up in the Azure cloud, and we were using Azure Data Factory as the data pipeline tool to bulk extract data out of Salesforce into Snowflake, and then the reverse ETL part of it, which was pulling the data from Snowflake and pushing that back to Salesforce. The Azure Data Factory was powering that. But I say that just so happens to be a technology that I've had a lot of success with, and I have that technology down to when I do data migration, it's literally a play button and it will run through the entire data. Like all 20 of those objects for Hager Sisters was a push button, and I hit play and it run through all the way from beginning to end. And so that just happens to be a technology that I've iterated through my own journey, but there's many a data pipeline and data harmonizing and movement capabilities out there. And by all means, if you are one of those vendors that have come to this webinar, I'm always looking for new and better ways to do it. It just so happens I use Azure Data Factory.
Looks like we have 2 more questions here. Do you have to use Snowflake with the migration with this approach?
You don't. I've tried it just so happened, at least for me, with me running them, I've just found that Snowflake does it really, really well. In other migrations where I'm dealing with millions of records and I'm having to go into, like, I'm using Datameer, obviously. I've had to slice and dice tens of millions of records, and it does it at the same speed at what I was just showing you with, a few hundred records. And so I lean toward Snowflake because when the pressure's on and I've got a really tight deadline that I know I need to meet, I don't have time to wait around and kind of fumble through other potential technologies. And so like Snowflake is my sweet spot, but technically you could do data migration with any technology. As I showed you in my ETL diagram, we were using SQL Server and Pentaho, and it worked great. It just took twice as long.
It looks like we got a couple more coming in. Is Data Tools Pro a data migration project management tool only, or is it more than that?
At this point, it's really more of a project management tool, a little bit of metadata management, and that's the furthest we've taken it at this point. It's not moving. It doesn't have, by design, it doesn't have access to any data. So right now it only ingests metadata, but we're pushing it to do some of the project management lifting because that's one of the pain points. But we're integrating it into more formal project management tools like Jira and Confluence. So I'm not necessarily trying to make it we're releasing it as a free utility for now, but it's mostly helping with the project management and facilitating some of the metadata management.
Okay, we got, another one just popped in. How do you manage Snowflake costing during your Datameer projects? Datameer is third party, so how do you plan?
So yeah, there's 2 things. One is we actually have a role for our data analysts. So how I was using Datameer from an analytics perspective is we had a role and we were tracking utilization and cost for our data analysts. And from my seat as a data and analytics executive, when I saw the costs for the data analyst work going up, that equals or equates to utilization. So from an analytics perspective, I was looking at that as a good thing. The way that Datameer runs on top of Snowflake is it's only utilizing Snowflake when you're using Datameer. I know that there's other products on the marketplace that have like shadow utilization where it's like running up your Snowflake bill, even when no one's using it. Datameer has not done that. When we use it, we get billed. When we're not using it, we're not getting billed, which has been huge for me. My Snowflake bill for running data migration was $150 just for my for that the Hager sister migration, the total bill, and that was 2 months, well, 6 weeks, right? You had the timeline, and continuous development, and it was quite inexpensive. But yeah, day to day, we have a role for our analysts, and that's kind of how we track and manage the costs. But as a data leader, I justify that cost that my analysts are in there, they're slicing and dicing data. There isn't anything else to do in Datameer. So from my seat, it's a good thing when the cost goes up on that data analyst role.
Okay, one last one. How do you deal with securing sensitive PII or personal identifiable information?
That is a great question. So when dealing with sensitive PII, because you have to, when you're doing data as an analytics pro, we didn't have to deal with a ton of sensitive PII because it's not needed for reporting and analytics. But when it comes to data migration, you're dealing with a lot of sensitive PII. So there's two things. One, on the Snowflake side of things, we set up data masking policies. So the data analysts who are working on the data, doing the slicing and dicing that I was showing you, any sensitive PII gets masked from those roles so that they cannot see them. However, when it comes to moving the data, the actual piping of data out of the existing system, but certainly when it goes into Salesforce, we assign a role for the data pipeline tool, obviously to have access to the data unmasked so that it can securely go over the pipe into Salesforce. But when it comes to the actual data migration project and all that slicing and dicing and access to data, we actually mask, and that's even part of Data Tools Pro, is we look for and flag sensitive PII fields so that it's clear as day that those are the fields that need to be masked inside of Snowflake. And it's, I may have an article. If not, then I probably need to post one around how you do that, because Snowflake makes it super simple to mask sensitive PII.
So that's it from our Q&A side of things. Ryan, do you have anything final to say here?
No, thank you. For those of you who stayed on to the Q&A and those of you joined us, really appreciate it. Look forward to hearing back from the community here, and hopefully there's a couple of nuggets of knowledge to take away to apply to your data migration projects.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan, and everybody who attended. We will close it out here. Thank you.